This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode, I'm joined by Chris Whitelock, author of Growing Fruit, to explore how modern varieties are reshaping the way we grow fruit at home. We discuss everything from choosing space-saving or container-friendly trees to tackling pests, diseases, and even the challenge of keeping birds off your harvest.
I mean, I've worked in horticulture all my working life, and it's just something that I've always been interested in fruit. And I was given the opportunity, asked if I wanted to write a book and what the subject would be. And I think it was really my natural interest was fruit.
Excellent. And so you've written a book called Growing Fruit. Does it cover all sorts of fruit?
It covers the main types of fruit which are hardy in Britain. I don't have the exotics or whatever. So in terms of tree fruit, it's apples, pears, plums, cherries, and the main soft fruits, but nothing too exotic.
So as you say, you've been doing this for all of your working life. I wondered how much have modern varieties changed the way that we select and manage fruit trees? Has the life of the fruit grower become easier over the years?
That's a difficult one. It has and it hasn't. It has for some things, like there's been new varieties, rootstocks and technology. Sometimes I'm afraid that what makes it more difficult is things like pests and diseases which have turned up and created new challenges.
Yes, I suppose it's a bit of a balancing act, really. You have to take the rough with the smooth.
It is. I mean, there's always advantages and disadvantages, and things like some of the new pests and diseases create a challenge, but there's also a lot of exciting new varieties and techniques which have made the job easier.
I think probably the people listening will already have basic knowledge of fruit growing. I mean, I don't like to assume things, but I think probably a lot of people will do. So I'd like to talk to you a bit more about the specifics and get into the nitty gritty, and particularly touch on things that people might not be aware of or might not have come across, because I think a lot of what you've written in the book, it really goes into depth. So I first wanted to start talking about how we could grow fruit trees successfully. And I know a lot of people will be traditionally growing them in open ground, but I wondered how viable it is to grow the majority of fruit in containers.
That has been made a lot easier. And the reason for that is that there's been a lot of new or the availability of dwarfing rootstocks. And so it is possible. I mean, with apple trees, they can be grafted onto the very dwarfing rootstock M27, and they can be grown into containers. With pears, there's a new rootstock, Quince Aline, which makes a very small, compact tree. With plums, there's the pixie rootstock, and cherries even now is possible to grow them in containers. So life is a lot easier growing stuff in containers.
And in addition to the rootstock, is there anything else that people should look for when they're selecting a tree for a smaller space?
Sometimes the variety as well has an effect. So yes, there are sometimes naturally compact varieties which make life a lot easier for growing in containers.
And how about if you had poor soil? I know everybody assumes that you need to have good soil to grow fruit trees and to get good results. If you didn't have particularly good soil, is it a question of improving the soil in order to grow fruit successfully? Or are there some plants that just flourish in poorer soils?
And that's a difficult one, because very dwarfing rootstocks generally want a good soil. So if you're growing them in containers, you would buy a decent growing medium to fill the containers to grow the plants in. But yes, poorer soils, I'm afraid, require a more vigorous rootstock, and that generally means a larger tree. But it is possible to grow trees in soils that are not ideal, but just be careful. Don't have too dwarf a rootstock and expect good results.
That's good advice. Staying on the theme of smaller gardens, probably a lot of people would like to have a tree that maybe is multi-performance. So perhaps it fruits, but it also looks good maybe with autumn colour, or it looks good once it's in bloom because of its ornamental qualities. Is there anything that you can think of that's a kind of standout good all-rounder?
Oh, there's lots, absolutely lots. For example, the cooking apple variety Arthur Turner received an award of merit as a flowering tree. In other words, if it didn't produce a single fruit, it'd still be worth growing in the garden. I think apple blossom full stop is very attractive, and you would say that they look good. Pears to me are always nice. Pear blossom in spring, the white flowers are gorgeous. I love the summer glossy foliage, and often you produce good autumn tints. Interestingly enough, the Asian pear is particularly ornamental, and that has nice autumn tints, good summer foliage. Cherries, well, cherry blossom is attractive, and I think that fruiting cherries are the equal of many flowering cherry varieties. I particularly like the cherry morello, which is an acid cherry, but it really is very, very freely flowering. In terms of other fruits, things like blueberries produce excellent, really rich autumn tints, and they really are worth growing just for that autumn display.
I'm trying to think of sort of various conditions that people might be interested in growing in. And in an ideal world, we'd all have perfect gardens with a bit of shelter, adequate sun, good soil. But obviously, that's not always the case. I think probably a lot of people in urban locations now are possibly getting more into growing food or thinking about how they can incorporate a multifunctioning tree into their space. If you had an urban environment, and I guess bearing in mind that it's possibly drier, probably warmer, are there any good trees for that situation?
I think that pretty well all fruit trees would be ideal in that situation. Fruit trees like a little bit of shelter, particularly when they're in flower, because pollinating insects, they don't like windswept conditions. Warmth is never a bad thing, particularly with some of the stone fruits as well. So there's really urban gardens that shouldn't be put off growing fruit.
And at the other end of the extreme, as you say, windswept conditions, anywhere that's particularly exposed or anywhere that is susceptible to, say, late frosts and things like that, is there anything that's fairly bomb-proof in that type of location?
Well, things like damsons were always traditionally grown as windbreak trees, so they really do take difficult conditions. But apples as well, an awful lot of apples were produced in sort of northern climates, so they're pretty tough. But damsons are particularly tough, and damson fruits do make absolutely excellent fruit. If you have the variety Merriweather, superb for cooking or making into conserves.
If you had a beginner who was getting into fruit growing, are there any specific varieties that you would say, yeah, that's a really good entry level one that's kind of a reliable cropper and doesn't need too much work?
I think I'll go the others, what they should avoid. Things like with apples, most people say, oh, an apple, oh, I think I'll go for Cox's Orange Pippin because that's the one they know. That's quite a difficult one because it gets a lot of pests and diseases. A lot of the modern varieties have been bred for disease resistance. I think the biggest problem that could happen is that you could have disease outbreaks and that can cause problems. I mean, there's some excellent varieties. I like the variety Scrumptious, which is self-fertile. In other words, it doesn't need a pollination partner, reasonably disease resistant, and gives you reliable crops of fruit very early on.
And thinking about, again, with urban gardens, there's quite often an imbalance of the biodiversity in there, and you might find a proliferation of slugs or squirrels or pigeons, that kind of thing. Is there anything that is fairly reliable? I don't think anything's going to be unpalatable to those kind of things, but, is there anything that shows some resistance to that?
I mean, unfortunately, if we like them, something else will like them. So being unpalatable would probably mean being unpalatable to us as well. In terms of fruit, probably apples are the easiest to grow. Birds have an annoying habit of pecking the fruit when it's very ripe. And it's just one of those things. Usually with a fruit tree, you can allow a certain amount to go to birds or other pests and still have more than enough for your own use. There's an abundance.
Yeah, exactly that. So some for you and some for them. And also, I was thinking about if you wanted to try something a little bit more unusual, if you were an experienced grower and you thought, I'm going to try my hand at something new, are there any new varieties or kind of older ones that have fallen out of fashion that you would say, yeah, that might be a bit of a showstopper in the garden?
Well, in terms of apples, there's 7,500 varieties, and most of those can be grown in Britain. Some are totally unsuitable to the British climate. So things like, the pink lady that you see, which is actually Crips Pink, an Australian variety. But there's some very good varieties that have come out. I mentioned the apple variety Scrumptious. It's gorgeous, picked straight from the tree, and you can't buy it in supermarkets. There's one called May Queen that I love. It's an old-fashioned variety, and it would keep until spring, hence its name. There's also another one called Winter Gem that I like. And I said that be careful, don't grow Cox's Orange Pippin because it tends to be very prone to pest and disease. But there's a plant or a apple variety with a lot of Cox characteristics called Christmas Pippin, which was believed to be a seedling from Cox's Orange Pippin being one of the parents. A lot of Cox attributes, absolutely superb fruit, and that is well worth growing.
Good to know. And is there anything else apart from apples that you would think, oh, yeah, that's a good one that people might not have come across?
For pears, I would go for one called Concord. Pears, I always say that the most delicious pear of all is one called Doyen de Comis, but unfortunately it's a warmer climate than we have in Britain, and Conference is a more reliable pear. The two have crossed, so Conference and Doyen de Comis, to get a variety called Concord, and it's got the attributes of both parents. It's got the flavour, in my opinion, of Comis and the reliability of Conference. So it's an excellent variety. For plums, well, the mainstay is Victoria is a good variety. It's heavy cropping, dual purpose, but it is rather large and a little bit prone to disease. There is a variety called Jubilee, which comes from Sweden, I believe, and that's a very good choice. And for cherries, there's a variety called Stella, which is very nice. It's reliable and it's quite late, so you can pick them often when cherries are not quite so commonly available. So there are some really super varieties.
And where would you go to source some of these more unusual varieties?
I mean, say the obvious may be to your local garden centre. The problem is garden centres will stock what people ask for, want. And it invariably means a very restricted range. And unfortunately, things like Cox's Orange Pippin, which is, as a little bit disease prone, but the internet has made a lot of specialist nurseries now being able to offer their stock. So there's a lot of very good specialist nurseries available, and some of them have got several hundred varieties available. It's amazing.
Mm. And has there been a resurgence in people wanting to grow varieties that are local to them or like heritage varieties? And if so, are they fairly tricky to source sometimes?
No, they're not. The specialist nurseries I recommend, many of them will have a selection of heritage varieties. But I would just put the point, yes, heritage varieties existed because in many ways they could be grown at a time when chemicals for treating fungus or whatever were not available. So they were good, robust ones. But there's also some very good new varieties as well. So I wouldn't overlook the new ones, always in favour of heritage. A little bit of balance, like a lot of things, is always best. So there's some very good new ones and there's some excellent heritage varieties.
So I'm going to move on to, as you said, things that might afflict trees or plants. And I liked your approach in the book because you're quite hands-off and philosophical about it. And you quite often say, well, just let it be, or, it's not going to kill the plant, so ride it out. And I like that approach, to be honest. And I was thinking about starting with apple trees. What are some of the more common things that people might encounter with their apples?
I think the number one disease is scab. And scab causes brown patches on the leaves. Cox's orange pippin is an absolute martyr to scab. The scab will also go onto the fruits. Now, it doesn't mean to say you can't eat them. You can eat them. It just probably will affect their storage, though having said that, people generally these days don't store fruit. They want to pick it off the tree and eat it straight away. But scab is the main one. And what I would recommend, and this is why sourcing from a good specialist is actually source varieties which are resistant to scab rather than the ones which are prone. I mentioned Cox's orange pippin. I know it's horticultural heresy to say something a little bit bad about it, but it is an apple that is very, very prone to scab. If you can, get disease-resistant varieties. They're in the new ones and the heritage varieties as well.
And you mentioned something which is one of the more obscure things to my knowledge, and that was collar and crown rot in apples. Can you talk about that?
Well, it's caused by sometimes deep planting of the tree. It's very, very important when you plant the tree to make sure that the depth of planting is correct. Look for the soil mark on the plant, or alternatively, if it's a pot-grown tree, which most of them are, make sure that the level of the root ball is just very slightly below soil level. Do not plant the tree too deeply, or you're prone to getting collar and crown rot in the tree.
And moving on to plums, again, I have found these problematic in the past. Maybe it's the varieties I've worked with, but they certainly seem more tricky than apples. What are some of the more common things people might find with plums?
I think the biggest problem sometimes with plums is loss because of frost damage. Plums tend to flower a little bit earlier than apples, so if we have late spring frosts, that can take the fruit off. The other thing, is fortunately not overly common, is a thing called silverleaf. And that is where you will notice that the leaves are turning sort of silvery white. And then there's dieback, and often it may result in the complete loss of the tree. Now, how you avoid silverleaf is never prune them in the winter months. In other words, you don't prune them with months with an R in them. So it's from May to August. Summer pruning is very important. Plums don't like heavy pruning, but certainly not in winter time.
And how about plum moth? Is there anything you can do about that?
To be perfectly honest, the codling moth of plums, you can get codling moth traps, which are based on a pheromone which attracts the males, and literally they come to a sticky end. Those are freely available. Now, they're not 100% effective, and commercial growers, you use them more for monitoring the pest rather than actually controlling it. But for amateur gardeners, I think that's more than enough. But please make sure you're buying a codling moth trap for plum moth and not one for apples. They're totally different species and use a different attractant.
Excellent. Good advice. And thinking about cherries, and this is something actually that applies to probably a lot of the fruit that you cover in the book, and that is birds coming down and pinching your cherries. I mean, I've personally experienced rats coming along and eating my cherries, but, I don't know if I can do a lot about those. But birds are an issue. But I've always found that when you net, quite often the netting can be dangerous. And it's quite often ineffective anyway. I've put in a fruit cage and, things just come and rip through the netting, and then you end up with birds trapped in your fruit cage. And in the end, I'll be honest, I've just given up. I mean, how effective is netting in your experience?
I don't net because what you were saying, unfortunately, netting can trap birds. And if you're not there all the time, you can't release the poor creatures. And it's not a particularly nice end. And I've seen it where things like sparrowhawks will then go into the nets and catch the captive birds. What you can do, and it's got some effect, is that you can use sort of decoy raptors. These are hung high above. Birds naturally sense that predation comes from above. But birds are not stupid, and so the use of a decoy raptor, after a short while, they realise it's only a plastic thing and it's not there to be worried about. So don't leave them there permanently. Only bring them out and hang them above the fruit just as the fruit is starting to ripen. Otherwise, they'll become used to it. I mean, the other thing, if we can still get hold of them, are CD-ROMs, because they flash and they move and they create movement above the crop, which can also just put anything but the most dedicated blackbirds off. Blackbirds are one of the most capable harvesters of fruit.
That's a good way of putting it. So there's a few more sort of random things I wanted to ask you about. One was pear bedstraw aphid, which I've not come across, thankfully.
With a lot of aphids, aphids can breed very quickly. They give birth to pregnant babies. The babies themselves have already got their grandchildren inside them. There's a thing called parthenogenesis. I think a student of mine once defined parthenogenesis as the ability to breed without the interference of males. So they can breed very quickly, but in a natural system, aphids will have a lot of predators. Things like, we'll know that ladybirds are very efficient predators of aphids, hoverflies, lacewings, and of course the wasp as well, which I know, we hate them with a vengeance when they start going for our drinks in the summer, but wasps in the summertime are very efficient predators. Now, if we feel that we can't just rely on natural predation to deal with the aphid, there are now natural oils which give a coating over the plant, and that can reduce aphid damage quite considerably. So there's no need to do the eternal spraying every 5 minutes. In fact, with synthetic chemicals, aphids rapidly develop resistance. And so what you find is that, they just stop working. As I say, the natural plant oil-based materials work very effectively. It provides a good, effective means of control. But if the tree is getting a bit on the large side, probably spraying is quite uneconomic. And so I'm afraid it's one of those things. Just let Mother Nature have some, and there'll be plenty for you as well.
And the other one I wanted to ask you about was, and I know I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but phyllidae in strawberries, or phyllidae. It looks like hairy strawberries.
Yes. If it's something that is happening all the time, remove the plant and put something else in. It can be annoying. It's just a disorder, which is one of the many things. I mean, strawberries are wonderful plants, but they do have a multiplicity of pests and disease. Growing them is a bit of a challenge, but having said that, if you really want proper nice strawberries, grow your own. If it's a minor, just cut off the affected blossoms and see what happens. But if it's constant, I'd say it might be time to replace the plants.
The last one I was going to ask you about, which again might not be on people's radar, is the spotted wing. And again, I'm not going to pronounce this correctly. Spotted wing Drosophila?
Drosophila, it's a fruit fly. I'm afraid that is a really serious pest. About 10, 15 years ago, and they were spotting, and they were really paranoid on the strawberry plantation, because they said that if they saw any fruits with this fruit fly, they would immediately bury them in a very, very deep trench. Now, the problem is that this fruit fly has come from Asia. And you see, we've had fruit flies for ever since, we've been growing fruit. But this one is new, because whereas conventional fruit flies, they wait on for very, very over mature fruit, they insert their eggs into the fruit, and then the larvae feed on it. This has a ovipositor, the thing that puts eggs into the fruit. It's sharp and serrated, and they can put their eggs in developing fruit. And that is the problem. Whereas in the past, fruit fly have only been a problem with over-mature fruit. This is a really serious pest. Now, it's a pest of pretty well all the soft fruit, but it's also a pest of plums and cherries. Now, we haven't had it along for very long, but it's already causing all sorts of problems. Now, there are a lot of research has gone on to producing special traps, baited traps, which have got an attractant in. Alternatively, the fruits are actually netted. Now, the net has to be very, very fine. I think it's about 0.9 millimeter, incredibly fine netting to stop these pests because they're very, very small. So ordinary garden netting just wouldn't have any effect whatsoever. Now, the problem is, unfortunately, the pest is overwintering. Things like sloes or whatever in hedgerows can act as hosts for the spotted wing Drosophila. Let's hope it doesn't become too much of a pest because that is serious.
Thank you very much to Chris for sharing his vast knowledge and to you for listening. If you like this episode, you might also like episode 334 with Joshua Sparks and episode 65, Apples. rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.